Good afternoon, good evening, good morning, everyone. Thank you very much for joining from the Philippines to the US and comrades in Africa. Really great to have you here. I am really pleased to have with us in the first series of workshops that we are organizing for our course, The Future is Public, to have with us David Hall, Professor David Hall, who is a visiting professor at the University of Greenwich in London, working in the Public Services International Research Unit, of which he was a director for nearly 15 years. David is not just an academic, he's also a strong activist and working together with trade unions. He was just telling us just before we connected his involvement with trade unions well before many of us were born in 75, and trying to fight the policies of IMF and World Bank, and ever since been involved very heavily in this direction. So thank you so much, David, for making time for us and for your amazing contribution to the course with 2 video lectures in the chapter 2 of the course on both the question of privatization and of the public finance. So the way how we are going to organize the session is just 1 hour. We want to have about 30 minutes discussing the question of privatization. Many of you have made questions when you actually registered for the workshop. Many of you have commented in the platform, so we have read everything. And we will, of course, try to put some of these questions to David, but priority would really be given to your direct engagement with David here today. So if there are no other questions, then we will try to look at what you put in the platform. Otherwise, we want to make this space as interactive as possible. So please do take the floor. Just for you to know, we are going to record this session. If you don't want to be seen, please turn your camera off. Otherwise, we would really prefer that you keep your cameras on, because it's hard to be online and to see only black boxes. So please do keep the cameras on. And it's going to be really a short input from David, first on the question of privatization, and then we'll open for discussion, and then a question of public finance for public services. So I stop it there. David, thanks again. And yeah, welcome to the first workshop of our course. And over to you on the topic of privatization.
Okay, Edlira, thanks very much, and thanks very much for inviting me onto the course. It's always fantastic to be at international meetings of activists from all over the world. Not as much as in the flesh, but online is still terrific. This in itself is part of the process and a really positive part of it. So congratulations for organizing the course, and thanks for inviting me. I did the video, which you may have seen. So I just want to sort of remind you of some of the points by asking some questions about what you've been doing as part of that. Because the first way that I tried to structure the introduction was to understand what happens by seeing it as a kind of constant political economy of constant continuous struggle. That there's groups of people, there's literally people, that's us, workers and communities. Then there's groups of capital, that's the businesses. They're struggling and fighting for something as well. And then there's a third body, which I didn't mention too much in the videos, but there's government. And government is what we all want to do, what's better for us. And so, but to understand the system, we need to understand we're in a struggle, and I guess you all are. So one thing I'd really like to hear is, what are the big fights over privatization in your country at the moment for your unions, and what you're fighting for, whether it's at local level or national level. It's always the most illuminating thing to talk about specifics. The companies have really got a very simple objective, which is draining money out of the system. But it's a bit contradictory because they don't want to pay taxes either. So what they want, they're reasonably happy with big public services and infrastructure projects as long as they can make money out of it. If they're not making money out of it, they don't want to pay taxes for it and they don't want to do it. And that's another thing that I've got a question for. If you've got examples of where privatized companies have just clearly been doing a bad service just to make money, just to increase their margins. So, okay, so and then we need to be clear in our heads about what's wrong with privatization. That this isn't a theoretical position. You wouldn't get so many millions of people mobilized all around the world around theoretical positions. Okay, so we need to look at the concrete material effects, and so the biggest category is the economic effects, the profits that companies make. They make at the expense of workers and at the expense of services. It's fairly simple. One key bit of research and key thing to argue about, and so again, a question to you, have you found yourself arguing about this, is efficiency. People are always saying and assuming, the private sector is so much more efficient, etc., etc. Well, it isn't. Studies show it isn't, and real people's experience show it isn't. So it's quite important and useful for us to talk about the arguments over that and experience over that. The second big area is the way that democratic control is, and the strength of democratic bodies is weakened. If the public sector isn't there to employ people, then it hasn't got the capacity to deliver the services, so the field's all open for just the private sector to walk over it. We mustn't let our public sector get eroded. And so again, things like running down training centers, which is what the World Bank did in the 1990s in sub-Saharan Africa, really undermining the public sector by undermining training of workers. Is that happening? Tell us about the training and whether there's fights over that. And the third thing is just reshaping a public service to make it work for the private sector. So the private sector doesn't want to be doing work in areas where they're not going to make any money. And so what we see in countries has been the uh, ending of kind of nationwide services like water services and saying, no, let's just split it up, split off the capital. We can make money running that. The rest of the country, forget it. We're not interested. And so you get a real distort shaping of the structure of public services. Another example saying healthcare has to be done through private insurance systems, because obviously that means it goes through the private sector. So, okay, so those are the questions and questions to you as to whether you're experiencing any of this, and just reiterating that last thing that I raised, for example, whether healthcare is being promoted as on the basis of private insurance rather than public systems, and it makes a difference. Public systems saves life. Private systems, the research shows, improbably actually lead to higher mortality rates. So over to you guys. Please tell us what's going on. Tell us what the issues are and what the key questions are.
Thanks very much, David. Just a little notes out of the reading the comments that have been in the platform. Overall, one could say that what seems to be more pervasive, at least of what we see in the platform, is privatization in the energy sector and health sector. So that's the examples that most people refer to in the platform. But of course, we open now up for the group. Please use this opportunity. David is perhaps one of the best experts on public services, so do use the opportunity to make questions or comments or whatever you think it's valuable. Yes, please.
Right, thank you for doing this. And it's very early where I am, so I might not be completely coherent. But we're having all of those things happen. I live in Alberta, in Canada, and we have basically a fascist government at the moment. And what I see happening here is that the government is basically hiving off what is profitable and productive and giving it to their friends. So it's also a question of not just privatization, but creating a huge disparity in wealth. And what can we do? Is basically my question.
Thanks very much, Anne. Is there somebody else who want to jump in, or we could perhaps collect a couple of questions, comments, and then back to David? Or Brian, would you like to say something, or is just thumbs up?
Yeah, it was supposed to be a hands up. It's even earlier over here in California, so apologies. Hi everyone. Good morning, David. I'm doing some research in for the United States or for the Railroad Workers United, and the rail here are private. And I was kind of wondering, one of the things that concerns me as an American is the mindset that so many people in the population have on privatization versus things being public. And so one of the things I was wondering was, it's very different, I think, in other places. Maybe I'm wrong, but how do you push back on that mindset across the population that, private is best? I mean, we have a healthcare system that is barbaric. I mean, truly barbaric. But many people, a decent amount of Americans, really do believe like if it went public, it wouldn't work. The lines would be too long and that kind of thing. And so I guess what I'm getting at is really just that sort of that mindset that the population has. What are your views on that? And how to push back?
Thanks very much. I thought, Brian, you wanted to say something, or did you change your mind?
Yeah, I would like to add. So actually, my concern is related to Anne and Brian's concerns on the government, because the government's capability to hold public service, because for your lecture, David, showed that the private powers are trying their best to drain money from public services. But for example, in the Philippine case, they had the opportunity to hold the public service, but they just can't. They don't have the capabilities. They failed. So, for example, in the power sector, they failed. They have big financial losses. So they just gave up and gave it to the private sector. So how can I think my question is, how can the government increase its capabilities and expertise, instead that knowledge, how to get back the knowledge that is drained away from public service? Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Brian. And David, we take one more from, okay, how should I call you? Elma, Joyce, Hex, and so whatever you prefer.
Jack. Yes. Good evening, everyone. I'm Jack. I am a migrant domestic worker here in Hong Kong, but I'm also from Philippines. My question was that it regards into public services. It is because of is it necessary for the people to pay for the health care that was being provided in our by the government? In the Philippines, for us, we are mandated to pay the 5% mandatory payment for our health service. That is our health service or universal health care. So my question is it necessary? Is it necessary for us to pay for that, or for the government to provide for that? Thank you.
Thanks a lot. David, over to you.
All right. Can I try responding to those in reverse order? So I'll pick up on Jack's point first, and that's partly because I think that raises a question about public finance, which is what we're going to talk about in the second half of this section a bit. And no, it's not necessary to pay uh, as a patient, as it were. Public healthcare can be financed and is better financed by taxation so that everybody's paying for it all the time instead of just when you need it, or everybody's paying it in a big pool so that everybody's insurance contributions cover all of us. So there aren't big inequalities and unaffordable charges made. So it's a question that can be argued about in terms of efficiency of a public healthcare system. It's not public healthcare if people are having to be charged for it according to their own resources and needs. I think it's fair to say. So that is something very much to be focusing on and fighting over and saying, no, the cost of healthcare systems needs to be shared. Otherwise, you don't get the benefits. It's not an efficient way of running a healthcare system for the public. We can reclaim that idea of efficiency. The question about from the Philippines in relation to energy systems, about how the public sector can reclaim the capacity to do and manage and run energy systems after they've been privatized for what, 30 years now, I think, in the Philippines, almost 25, 30 years. Is a hard one, but a real one. And again, you can build it into demands and plans. I mean, one possibility is to say, well, the public sector needs to be training and employing its own staff who are experts in this, even to regulate the private sector. Yeah, to manage the system at all, there has to be training, there has to be a workforce, and that's where public service units are very well placed to carry out this role. And going back to the point about training that I made earlier, that insisting on keeping up this training. I was talking to someone who works for local government in the Netherlands a few months ago, and she was saying how they're doing so much on the energy system for two or three reasons. The first is that, extraordinarily, unusually, but very simply, the privatization of the energy grids is illegal in the Netherlands. It's against the law. Only public authorities can run energy grids in the Netherlands. What that means is that the local governments run the grids, which means they employ the staff who knows what's happening, which means they know how to plan for plugging in electric cars and things like that, as well as working out programs for development of renewable energy and cut back on emissions. So having that capacity, even for regulation, is vital, and that can be used as an argument. But also the importance and possibility of simply terminating concessions that aren't working. That it's bad enough that companies manage to get away with having privatized service when it is working, but when it's not working, it should be unequivocal. They get ended, they get taken back in-house. And again, even here in the UK, and this moves on to the next one, working backwards, we found with railway systems that that has started happening here, even in the UK, that when railway concessions or contracts to operate pan out so badly, we ran campaigns that were just really strongly demanding that there should be a public sector body with the capacity to take them back into the public sector. That was effective. Even our Conservative government was forced to set up a public sector entity that could take back what they originally thought would be exceptional of bad performing public authorities. But now our Conservative government is almost boasting that it has brought back the great majority of privatized railways into public hands because the private contractors repeatedly, again and again and again, failed to do so. The network itself was renationalized because the maintenance was badly done by the private sector to the extent that there were crashes, there were deaths, people were killing them. And so in relation to rail network in the USA, the question is how do you change the mindset? It is difficult. It's different from country to country. Big differences, the mindsets. But one of the ways we can do it is precisely from drawing on international experience. We can say, if people here say, for example, wouldn't private healthcare be so much better than our NHS? We start talking about what happens in the USA. And in fact, I've done that. I've been on um, a series of meetings organized by the Health Workers Union in Slovakia some years ago when they were threatened with privatization. And they had the brilliant idea of inviting someone from the UK, that was me, to talk about how the NHS worked and how public healthcare works really relatively so well in the UK. And they invited trade unionists from the USA to come over and say how awful it was in the USA. And that was really important because the US obviously has a big kind of glamour attraction for everybody. So it's one of the ways we can get at that mindset is by drawing on this strength we have of the international knowledge of each other. And go right back to the original question then from Canada on what can we do? And the answer is this, and the answer is we keep going. We campaign. I'll take two examples of that. One of water in the UK, and I was working with the unions in one capacity about nearly 40 years ago it was, when Mrs. Thatcher announced privatization plans for the water sector. And we ran a brilliant campaign. Mrs. Thatcher abandoned it 18 months later. It was a disaster. Nobody wanted it. She then won the election so she could do whatever she wanted. She went ahead and privatized it anyway. But people still don't want it. And now we keep campaigning. We're still doing it. And it's starting to collapse under the strain of our campaigns. That's a long-term exercise. But short-term, even when things look bleak, I remember once I'd been in a meeting with trade unionists in Central America, and the trade unionists from Panama was talking about they'd been fighting for a year and a half to try and stop the plans to privatize the water system, parts of the school systems, and he said we just basically lost these battles. It's going to go ahead. It really is, and he'd fought tooth and nail to try and stop it. But then 2 months later, read in newspapers there were demonstrations on the streets of Panama City around Christmas with students and workers and everything about a host of issues. And the key issue they all combined on was no to privatization. There were presidential elections coming up in a few months' time, and every single presidential candidate rushed to say, vote for me, I'm against any of this privatization. And so suddenly, not suddenly, because it's the cumulative effect. You can't always see when it's going to happen. The cumulative effect of all those campaigns everybody been fighting for some years and months suddenly came together, and at least a partial victory that they backed off privatization. So, however bleak things seem, keep campaigning and keep doing it because it's the one thing that leads to victory, and people like it because we're basically right on this stuff. Not privatizing is much better for people than privatizing.
Thanks very much, David. I saw a couple of hands more, and I will give it a minute. But just to say, I mean, from the experience of my own country, the argument, and I'm from Eastern Europe, from Albania, and of course the argument was that we have to give it to, we have to hand over public services to the private because they can do it better than the miserable conditions that were in the public, in the state sector. But what we found out after 30 years is that wherever state services, public services, state-owned are bad, when the private comes in, you have all sorts of perversities. It's even worse. So strengthening of public sector becomes so important, even if you want to put some order into whatever privatized. I mean, of course, we have to fight off the privatization, but it's so central. You can't really say in the case of service in my country that if you have a corrupted state, it's going to be better if the private steps in. It's just completely the opposite. But okay, I don't want to abuse the role of moderating. So any other questions or comments to David on this part about privatization? Because if not, David, can you say us something about the public-private partnerships, the infamous PPPs? Because it was put into the platform as one of the questions, and I think perhaps it's worth it to just pick up a bit on that as we wrap up the discussion on privatization.
Yeah, sorry there. I'd meant to mention that and one or two of the other things. Yeah, PPPs, very, very good point. It constantly comes up, and it's partly related to another question as to why are governments tempted by privatization, huh? Because what PPPs, to summarize it crudely, are ways of getting the private sector to put up finance for expensive infrastructure projects that otherwise governments would borrow money for and get given a very hard time by international finance and so on for doing that. So, and by the IMF in particular for borrowing too much. And so that is one overwhelmingly powerful motivation. One of the European the European Investment Bank, in fact, once did a study of 25 countries that had used PPPs, and they asked them all the question, why did you use PPPs? Because there are very obvious disadvantages with PPPs. It's more expensive. It's a much more expensive way of doing it because the private sector makes profit and the private sector has to pay higher interest for borrowing. So why would you do it that way? The dream and the fancy is, oh, they're so much more efficient, but they're not. We know from experience and studies they're not. So the IB said to countries, okay, this was your PPP, you went ahead with it, and you had these more or less disastrous experiences. They weren't all bad according to the EIB, but quite a few. I said, why did you do it? You know, this was predictable. And they said, because there was no alternative. The IMF, the EU, international bankers told us you cannot, as a government, borrow the money necessary to do that. So we will do it, and that is the single biggest issue. Now, there's various things you can do on that. One is to just keep campaigning and saying governments have far more capacity to borrow than they think, or the IMF thinks, or act. But also, governments have bigger capacity to raise more in taxation than they think they do. And again, there's evidence that these pressures start changing. We can't come back to that. But the other thing with PPPs that's worth remembering is that when they go wrong in a big bad way. Buildings don't get finished, bridges don't get finished, the infrastructure doesn't get operated, and so. Sorry, this is maybe too long question, but again, going back to UK experience, where the UK itself was one of the countries that we first got very enthusiastic about PPPs under a Labour government, and this hugely expensive debt we've got as a result. After about 20 years of using our PPP system, which was known as the Private Finance Initiative, everybody, including the Conservatives, including all the politicians in Parliament, said, this doesn't work. This is hopeless. This is expensive. And quite extraordinary thing happened that, I mean, for those of us that have been campaigning against PPPs for 18 years, suddenly we were reading about bodies of members of parliament who were saying, yeah, we agree, this is rubbish, we should stop it. And so they agreed to stop it. It hasn't been entirely stopped, of course, it comes through in other ways. But once again, that thing about we have to keep campaigning, we have to keep exposing to say, this is a bad idea. You mustn't get pressured just by artificial restrictions on borrowing. So I hope that says something about PPPs, and ending on a positive note as well, that we can stop those too.
Yeah, thank you very much, really. Thanks a lot, David. If there are no immediate questions, we can pick up again later if something comes up. But shall we just perhaps move to the second part, which is about public financing? And I think it is connected to the questions that often the government say we don't have money, and that's why we need the private in. So, David, if you could give us some key arguments about the question of public finances and how to actually respond to governments when they come with this kind of arguments in terms of providing more space for private operators. You need to unmute.
Yeah, key thing on that basic question about it's not affordable is, and I should really have said this in the video, the big answer to the question about it's not affordable is it's not affordable to who? Because without public finance, without taxation, large sections of populations can't afford to have healthcare, can't afford to get energy, can't afford transport to work, etc., etc., etc. Low standards of life. With public services, with public transport, with public healthcare, people can live, people can survive, people can work. And so having public services makes huge sense for the majority of any population, basically. And so the question to be thrown back constantly is when people say it's not affordable, they're saying it's not affordable to the rich who are rich enough to, and this includes companies, who are rich enough to be able to afford all the services they need and don't want to be paying taxes or contributions to cover universal services or universal systems because that isn't directly to their benefit. And simply making politicians articulate that about not affordable to who is an important part of the political dialogue, I think. So once again, I mean, like the whole terrain of privatization, but also the whole terrain of public services, what you've got is a politically contested process in which public finance is a key part. If we can get governments able to raise taxes and willing to raise taxes, which means they've got, on one level, we could say they need to be more worried about us, the people, than they are about companies, their mates, in terms of what we think and what we say. And so it's a redistributive argument. With taxation, one of the issues is the effectiveness of a tax collection system. One of the things that companies and rich people like to do is to make taxation systems so complicated and to reduce the staff collecting them so that really, even if the law says they should pay taxes, they don't have to. They can get away with not doing it. And so this is partly also a capacity question, a capacity of tax collectors. And it's one of the nicest metaphors on public finance I've ever heard when about 15 years ago, there was a sort of left of centre prime minister in India who announced he was going to maintain levels of taxation, increase them to support public services. And he said, our tax collectors are like bees going from flower to flower, collecting pollen and fertilizing the flowers so that everybody can flourish. And it goes back to the point about that I make also in the video about the economic benefits of a lot of the public services we're talking about, energy, water and sanitation, but also healthcare, also housing, etc., and public transport. The benefits are benefits for the whole economy as well as for people. It's not just on an individual level. And so this is why the public finance can be thought of as a way of rearranging the flows of money in the economy so it works more efficiently for people. It's not just public services for individuals, that the individuals are getting something they don't have to pay for, and so isn't that a good thing or whatever. It's a system for the whole of society and the whole of the countries that works. So the first that's sorry, that's a long way round about using the not affording who can afford taxation. But then this argument about the whole economy, and we need to get in the argument about efficiency, because the implied argument there is the economy is driven by private entrepreneurs making money for themselves. And if you tax them to provide public services, that would just be a big burden. But again, historical research and people's actual experience shows the opposite. That countries with bigger spending on public services as a proportion of GDP do better in terms of, even on the conventional arguments about conventional measures of economic growth. And historically, it's such a strong relationship. Now, there are problems and issues about precisely what kind of economic growth we want. But in general, what it demonstrates is that their argument that this is a burden on the economy is simply not true. You can see it in the 19th century with the USA, where the development of energy systems, road networks, 19th to 20th century, energy systems, road networks, and water and sanitation networks were biggest single elements in America's growth, economic growth in that period. We're seeing it again now with China, that the last 30 years, China invested huge amounts in infrastructure, and that is clearly a major factor behind economic growth. So we can say the economies really can afford, and in fact need things. Okay, I won't say too much now about the details, but I said in the video about forms of taxation that are available that can be more productively made use of. Tax on profits, tax on high incomes, tax on land. Even the IMF lists these things out and says lots of countries can do this. The borrowing is always cheaper for governments than private sector. That's a privatisation argument, but it's an argument also against PPPs, and it's an argument again for the effectiveness of borrowing to develop services and develop networks. And finally, charges. I've said earlier that the benefits of the public service systems of the whole of society, the whole of economy, not just for individuals. And so even charges to individuals are a social thing. So we should be making sure that any charges for energy, water, and the like, are affordable. That there should be a basic floor of needs. And so a number of countries and places don't charge people for the first 50 litres of water per day, per week. Sorry. In order to provide a cross subsidy, so that people who consume more are cross subsidizing people who can't afford to consume more. So even the charges are a form of cross subsidy. And finally, in terms of benefits, public transport is the ultimate thing. There are so many social benefits from public transport, not just the passengers traveling, the individual benefits to the passengers who travel, but we all gain from less congestion, less pollution, less expenditure on private cars and petrol. That there is good reason for saying we just all pay for this through taxation. It makes better sense. It's a collective benefit, so we should pay collectively. So, okay, sorry, that's getting a bit more technical, gone on a bit longer, and I didn't ask enough questions, but I have the general question. Tell me what the issues are to do with public finance in your country, the biggest ones that you face, and how you've tried addressing them, how people are trying to address them.
Thank you very much for that. It's open, whoever wants to take the floor. Yes, Ian, we'll come back.
Hi. I live in a very small country, Antigua and Barbuda, it's in the Caribbean, and PPPs have always been promoted as the model to address economies of scale, despite all the problems in other countries, whether it's based on the arguments, even the arguments you hear from a lot of the major international organizations, such as the World Bank and IMF. I haven't heard much about PUPs. I'm looking for resources in that aspect. How can we use PUPs to actually enhance public services?
You mean public-public partnerships, right?
Yes, public-public partnerships.
Thank you very much. Yes, anybody else? We do have something in the chat. David, a question for you. What possible alternatives to PPPs in the African context? And thanks, Anne, also for an alternative acronym for PPPs that you put in the chat. Private profit, public expense. Thank you for that. So why don't, oh yeah, Brian. Okay, we take Brian and then David over to you.
Just really quickly, yeah, with the Railroad Workers United, they're putting a big focus on sort of, I think, like the bargaining for the common good aspect, like what can this do for the public? I think one of the main things is safety. There was a big accident in East Palestine where the air and water is still toxic for the residents. And then I think they're also working on organizing the members and how it's going to benefit the members directly, because obviously when you have the private or the profit incentive, a lot of, as you mentioned before, like cutting costs, smaller crews, things like that. So that's some of the things that we're working on. I'm also doing some research right now on the Plum Plan, which was they sought to renationalize the railroads early after World War I, and just trying to figure out why that was so popular, because to be frank, at this point, and it ties into the American belief in sort of individualism and not wanting to pay collectively for things. Private automobiles are a huge deal here in the United States as well. And so I was just kind of wondering, what have you seen, if you don't mind, when it comes to the privatization of the rail, the workers, like what really motivated the workers to support it? So like for me, it sort of all begins and ends there. If they're not going to support that, then I think it's less likely the public's going to support it.
David, do you want to respond perhaps to this round?
Yeah. Okay. Two tough questions there. This area ends up being quite tough. Um, so Ian, I didn't catch which Caribbean country you're in. Can you remind me what country?
Antigua and Barbuda.
Barbuda.
Yes, Antigua and Barbuda.
Okay. Um, okay, fine. Um, in terms of PPPs, there are two things, and PUPs, which is what you're talking about. About 20 years ago, when we were working with PSI on PPPs in water and energy and things like this, people said, well, we need to come up with some alternative, something that sounds snappy or whatever. And we came up with the idea of public-public partnerships, which is what you mentioned, yeah, which the best acronym for which we could work out was PUPS rather than PPPs, huh? And so, yeah, so PUPS at least produces a smile, and people say, what's a PUP? You know, so you can then say, well, it's a public partnership. But then what kind of partnership is that? And we did it in a development context, really, because there was already established a practice from post-colonial period of public authorities in the water sector in particular. This was in both in Britain and Japan and France, public authorities working with public authorities in developing countries to help train them up, to help share the capacity. It was a training exercise, really. Um, and that we described as a typical public partnership. It had the virtue of nobody was trying to make large amounts of money out of it. It had the other virtue of building that capacity, that important capacity, in the public sector. And so one of the things that came out of that was training centres, and I said that was one of the things that World Bank and others try to stop. So at least that provided a way of sharing expertise that without involving the private sector. What pubs like that don't do, however, is provide a financial alternative, and that's tough. But they do provide an effective and a very cost-effective alternative in terms of capacity buildings. We did persuade the EU to actually fund experiment with pups in the water sector. One year they put up about 40 million euros to fund public agencies in EU countries partnering with um, public authorities in the global south. And so that's one thing. But as I said, what it doesn't do really is mobilize the finance, and that remains then an issue that you have to convince the government that it's affordable through progressive taxation or through responsible borrowing, or through forms of charging. Now, in forms of charging, you can get cross subsidy across sectors in some forms of charging. One of the interesting things that Ecuador did at one point, I don't know why historically, but at one point somebody said in Ecuador, look, the people connected to telephones, this was in the 1970s, 80s, the people connected to telephones are basically the richer people. Not everybody by any means was connected to telephones, whereas everybody needs water, and that costs money. So they introduced a surcharge for everybody who was connected to the telephone that was then used to finance the investment in water systems throughout the country. And it was simply quite, it created an extra source of income. It was an extra sort of source of taxation, in effect, but a progressive form of taxation. So there are mechanisms like that. Brian, in terms of in terms of rail and organising the members, common good and accidents, there's, I think, I'm trying to think again of I mean, there'd been. I don't want to make it too much about privatization to do it about finance rather than privatization, but the most of the issues I think have arisen in privatization context recently, and so when you get train crashes, there is a direct sort of common interest between rail workers and the public, huh? That the concern over any rail crash where there's loss of life is normally just as high among union members as the public at large who are using trains. And so that could and should hopefully be a form of organising, but it's a fairly a basis for organising people to get around it, but also simply a constant reminder to membership, and this applies to it in any union, I think, that actually a significant part of their standard of living, their standard of life, is down to public services. One of the other things that's not well known about public services, the economic effect of it, is the equalizing effect. There's again been lots of studies done, even by bodies like the OECD, about where the benefit from public services goes. And in any country, um, OECD countries, Latin American countries, everywhere studies have been carried out and asking the question, if we provide healthcare, public healthcare, if we provide public transport, if we provide, where do the benefits go? How are those distributed? And the benefits on the whole are remarkably evenly distributed. It's not that we only provide public health care for the poor people in need and the rich people can still buy great health care and so on and so forth. No, you're providing a whole system of whether it's public transport, whether it's healthcare, whatever, that everybody can use and take advantage of. And nearly always this turns out to be of very remarkably equal value. And that means two things. Firstly, it doesn't have to be taking things away from the rich to give to the poor. As long as they get the same, that equalizes things. Anything that's more equal than the original distribution of income is equalizing overall benefits. Secondly, the scale of these benefits to poorer people is much larger. And so when you get an equal amount of benefit in money terms from public healthcare systems, say, to the poorest 40% of people in the country, that is worth often as much as a quarter or a third of their entire cash income to be able to have public health care when it's needed. And it's stable. I mean, in the case of healthcare in particular, it stabilizes incomes and economy too. So that equalizing effect and that high effect on people's standard of living is should be talked about more. And you can see it again, I suppose, using the USA UK comparison on healthcare. If you look at the figures in the UK, in the USA, how much money do workers have to spend every year? What proportion of their income they have to spend every year on healthcare? It's pretty high. If you look at the same figure in the UK, it's tiny, really low, because it's all we pay for it through the taxation system. And so you can get those contrasts in terms of the benefits are just as real and tangible of public services as they are when you buy things individually over the counter.
Thank you very much, David. Do you want to reiterate anything on the PPPs? I mean, there was a question about PPPs in Africa. And then I think that we often get this question saying whether for particular regions, whether there is a special solution. And if you could speak a bit to that.
I missed that one. The answer is I don't think so. I think the economics and the politics are pretty similar everywhere in relation to PPPs. It's always economically inefficient. It's not true that private finance is cheaper in Africa than public finance. Both public and private finance are probably more expensive in Africa, but it's not true that private finance is cheaper than public finance. It never is. Nor is it true that the private sector is so much more efficient than the public sector in Africa than it is in other countries. Not true. Again, loads of big studies keep comparing these things. All these studies always come back and find the same thing. Nope, not significant difference in efficiency. So no, there's no particular reason why Africa should need PPPs.
Thank you. Any final questions as we're nearing the end, or comments to David? Ian, I know you asked whether you could find more information. I don't know precisely about what, but do send us an email, or you can ask David here, and then we can for sure facilitate that communication. Yeah, Brian, please.
Just really quick, Dave. And I didn't mean to turn it back to privatization over financing. When it comes to financing, one of the things I hear from people who, generally speaking, are pretty supportive of the idea of public services is that if we just run them if we just nationalize them, but we run them essentially like a private company, which has been done, then it's not going to work. And I was kind of wondering, do you feel like that's true when it comes to the financing? Are there certain ways to finance things that we need to be concentrating on, specifically in like transportation, healthcare? Is it all pretty straightforward in the way of financing?
Yeah, I wish financing was fairly straightforward, but I don't think it is. There's a lot of issues involved in winning those arguments that are very context dependent, particularly arguments to do with taxation. But I'll give you one example of a way that a lot of public infrastructure, stuff that people say has to be done by PPPs now, a lot of public infrastructure has been built over the decades, and in some cases still is. And that is, for example, if you want to build a sewage treatment plant, or if you want to build a stacks of solar panels on a farm, or wind turbines on a farm to generate renewable energy. One way historically that people did it, and it still happens in some places, was to say, okay, that means for the next 5 years, we're going to have to pay more. We are going to have to pay an extra 20% to pay for the construction costs involved, and so on. But we will listen to the arguments, we will have the discussion. It's where democracy is a big thing, and people can be convinced, yeah, okay, that's worth doing. And that's how a lot of our infrastructure got built. Toronto and Canada, Boston and USA, they were both hotbeds of stinking cholera-ridden, deadly cities, not much more than a century ago. And what they did was to say, okay, everybody's just got to put up money, and we have to build these systems to make sure it doesn't happen again. And then when it's built, you can put the charges back down again. You paid for it. It's not a capitalist way of financing it, but it's an effective way of financing it. It's been done recently. We came across it in Brazil, in Porto Alegre, that's famous for its participatory budgeting. And one of the things they used participatory budgeting for was exactly that. They said, look, there's too much sewage around in the city. We're going to need to build a sewage treatment plant. We're going to have to put prices up by 20%. This is why. And then they'll come down again after 4 or 5 years. And they went round in public, and the public said, yeah, that's good. That's a good way of spending an extra 20%. We agree. The politicians were horrified. They said, there's elections coming up. People won't vote for us if there's a 20% increase in water. But the guys running the service said, it's okay. We talk with the people. The people understand why. They're not going to vote you out for doing something this sensible. And so that process, I think, has more to it than people give credit for, not least because it's actually what the private companies try and do as much as possible. One of the things the private water companies here did was put up prices to pay for all the investment that's happening so they don't have to put in any capital. These capitalists, we just done the calculation, they put in very little capital to start with 30 years ago, and 30 years later, they have even less capital in the system. They don't keep putting in capital. It's us they keep charging to build the treatment plants, etc., etc. So that's something we should talk about more often, I think, because I suspect that happens in quite a lot of systems that private sector likes to sell as we're capitalists, we invest our trillions. Lots of the time, they don't.
Well, thank you very much, David. Lots of food for thought here. If I may add something on the PUPs, on the public-public partnerships, on which I also did some work years back, and we worked together on that too, David. Whereas they may not be providing funding, I think they become really important in bringing back public into public services, particularly when we are talking about these public-public partnerships. And I think there was Bello made a reference to there, which involves communities and workers. So it's really about democratizing the services. So they become also important spaces for transforming public services beyond sometimes, these hierarchical services that could be state services. And I think Sarvasara from India had a question on that, which we'll discuss in the next workshops. And finally, in terms of mobilizing, I think we had a conversation about this on May Day, actually, and it is important that we actually do challenge the normalization of extracting profits out of people's sickness, out of the fact that people have a constitutional right to water and to energy and to transport, and the fact that it has been normalized. And I think that's what we really need to fundamentally challenge, the immorality of making profit out of essential services of people and bringing back the services into public hands and public ownership and control. But yeah, amazing conversation. Thank you so much, everyone. And we are going to put the recording of this in the platform, and we'll continue the conversation with more workshops coming up for this course. So do stay with us. Many, many thanks again, David. And yeah, we will keep connected. Thank you.